You guys already know that Oda is a master of foreshadowing. I've literally built an entire channel around finding and analyzing tiny details from this story, which are likely to become significant later. But sometimes there's a bit of an adventure that we go through when we get something that seems noteworthy, like this should go somewhere. And then possibly sometimes hundreds of chapters could pass before we get any more about that, to the point that where you forget about it. You start questioning whether or not it was important or whether Oda forgot about it. Well, Elbaf has one of these things, absinthe or fairy green. Introduced at the beginning of this arc as a kind of booze which creates hallucinations, and now, I think not coincidentally, in the current chapters, the Straw Hats and the Giants are partying, and some Straw Hats, like Usopp, are drunk out of their minds. So I hope that you haven't forgotten about fairy green. But on one hand, speculation about fairy green does not seem to be that interesting. It's a booze which creates hallucinations. From that detail alone, if it comes up again, which I would assume that it does, you kind of already know how it's going to impact Elbaf. So here at JB Theories, we're going to ask the questions that not a lot of people do. Not really what effect fairy green might have on this arc, but instead, how does fairy green work? Because I think that the answer to this question might blow your mind. Hey YouTube, Joeboy here. So, honestly, I've had some difficulty trying to organize this video because all the information overlaps, comes back to itself, and so like how you can explain it can be done in multiple ways. So I guess I've decided to put what I think is probably the most important element of this at the end, just because I also think that it's going to be the hardest thing to believe, and I don't want you to click away. But anyway, let's begin here, right? I think that a lot of people take a booze that can make you hallucinate for granted. This is the wacky world of One Piece where anything is possible. But it would be fun to do a booze tracker throughout the entirety of this story. How many mugs of beer have everyone in the story consumed, right? And not a single one of them causes hallucinations aside from those that come from Elbaf. So what exactly are they doing here in Elbaf? Are they brewing it with peyote and mushrooms? I honestly think that Oda has a legitimate explanation for this pseudo-magical, it's not really magical, but you know, this unusual quality. And in my mind, the explanation doesn't just have to make sense or be tangentially possible, it's gotta make narrative sense, which rules out the giant just sticking some mushrooms in their booze, or the shits and giggles of it. So the first place that I would look to attempt to explain this is I would look at the country of Elbaf itself, and other countries like it, because I think that there is something strange about Sky Islands. You can directly compare the half of Jaya that remains in the Blue Sea with the other half of Jaya which is now up in the Sky Islands, and you can tell that the environments have completely changed the two halves of the same island. Essentially, Upper Yard in Skypiea, the plants and animals there have grown over large. They have literally become giant. This is not a theory. This is a fact. You can look at the South Bird in Jaya versus Upper Yard. Something has happened. And this remains the absolute best explanation for why giants, like giants that we're seeing in Elbaf, why giants exist in the first place. And for me, it's fitting that we find the homeland of giants on a giant tree, which is a pseudo-sky island. Basically, the climate up in the sky, some way, somehow, we'll get to this at the end of the video, creates giants. But not only do I think that this is a thing that's built into Oda's design for the universe, I do think that it will actually come up in the story, and Oda will have a One Piece scientific explanation for it, because giantification is an actual science that has plot relevance in the story. We know that the world government and Vegapunk and Caesar Clown have all been working on mastering how exactly to create giants. And this is not a total mystery to them because we've seen Caesar Clown in Punk Hazard experiment on children, giving them candy, which has literally made them larger. Maybe they're not giants yet, but they've figured out something. So similar to devil fruits, I do think that this process will eventually get explained. But to take a step back here, right? If we know pretty much that Sky Islands create giantification, then we also know that there is some unique property to these islands that would not be shared with others on the regular Blue Sea. So if the giants have special booze which has a special effect, it could actually be related to the country. The chemical which causes the giantification could potentially have other side effects. Again, look at the children from Punk Hazard. Caesar made them larger, but also fundamentally changed their personalities. in a very, very interesting way. You should probably brace yourself because I am about to slap you in the face. Maybe many of you forgot about Caesar's candy. Maybe many of you thought that the candy wasn't really that important. But it's important to know that within the candy was the chemical which causes the giantification. That is the whole reason it exists. But look, I'm not about to break it down scientifically. If you guys remember the children of Punk Hazard, probably the one thing that sticks out more than anything else is that when they didn't get their candy, they had massive withdrawal symptoms and became borderline monsters. They were angry little guys. I believe that the explanation that most of y'all came to on your own or through the community, however you did so, is that, well, the candy was very addictive. So because it was addictive, they had withdrawal symptoms. And withdrawal symptoms is why they were angry, because that's how withdrawal works. So look, I just want to tell you that whatever is causing the giantification could be the addictive element of candy, which causes the withdrawal symptoms. You all thought, well, the candy was just so tasty, so the kids flew off the handle. Or maybe Caesar specifically designed it to be that addictive, just so that the kids would never leave. But it is possible that Caesar did not think it through like that. A happy mistake, so to speak. It just so happens that the thing which creates the giantification also happens to be very, very addictive. So just hold this thought for a moment. We'll come back to it. There's an element of addiction, and it causes aggressiveness. There's another thing that we know for sure that candy does. Guys, candy causes hallucinations. You see, now we're going somewhere. You can reread chapters 674 and 675 on your own. But these chapters confirm without a shadow of a doubt that the children of Punk Hazard, while they're withdrawing from candy, also have hallucinations. One of the children confused Sanji's body for a cockroach. Mocha confused one of Caesar's subordinates for a snake. And Oda actually drew the panel he drew inside of Mocha's mind. So just full disclosure, right? Withdrawal from something extremely addictive actually can cause hallucinations in real life. But you gotta admit, it's kind of noteworthy that we know that fairy green causes hallucinations, and we have the candy which we know, absolutely know, has done the same thing. Putting these two things together, in my opinion, is not a stretch. But when we've talked about candy in the past, for those that have been watching the channel for a really long time, right? The candy and the whole story of the children is very interrelated with Big Mom. Hallucination in the post-time skip has not just come up one time. It has come up at least twice, because Big Mom experienced hallucinations as well. Big Mom, addicted to sweets, goes on rampages, has missing memories, also hallucinates. Her similarities to the children is curious. And even more than that, Big Mom's ties to Elbaf then make her connection potentially to Fairy Green also very curious. But I think that I need to explain this in a little bit more detail, because Big Mom's rages and her symptoms, her experiences, have occurred in distinctly different circumstances that not a lot of people talk about. Again, we could apply withdrawal to Big Mom, and I think it would make a lot of sense to a lot of people. Like at the very beginning of Whole Cake Island, Big Mom is thinking about the wedding cake, she's thinking about Croquembouche, she hasn't had it in a long time, and then she attacks Whole Cake Island. Classic withdrawal. However, when most people discuss Big Mom's rages, they lump all of these events together when potentially you shouldn't do that, right? Like, as an example, a lot of people include Big Mom's 6th birthday as one of her rages. It was during her 6th birthday that Mother Carmel and all the other orphans disappeared, and it is heavily implied that Big Mom ate them. But we got that entire flashback of Big Mom's 6th birthday, right? And she was not raging. There was no anger there. She was eating her delicious birthday cake, which was made of croquembouche, and suddenly she started seeing all the orphans and Mother Carmel as little pastries. Essentially, Big Mom was hallucinating. But there is absolutely no way that Big Mom at that moment was experiencing withdrawal symptoms. You don't withdraw when you are actively consuming the thing. Why is this important? Well, it's because it suggests that there is something within the tasty treat, some chemical, which is hallucinogenic, at least for Big Mom. I just want to let you know that I haven't forgotten that this seems to affect Big Mom uniquely and not everybody else in the same way. We will explain that. This is what we've already speculated about candy. Candy is very addictive. When you don't have it, yes, you can hallucinate. But the actual thing in the candy which causes giantification might also be hallucinogenic. But yeah, while we're here, the same thing occurred when Big Mom eventually ate the wedding cake. Again, not a rage, but Big Mom did hallucinate. We got to see inside of Big Mom's mind as she eats the cake, and my god, a Wonderland would be an understatement. She is in another universe entirely. In the manga, we don't get to see this for sure. Perhaps in the anime it expounds upon this a little bit. I'm not going to rewatch the anime just to be 100% certain. But all of this relates to the very first time that Big Mom had Simla in Elbaf. In the actual manga, you can see her try Simla for the first time, her eyes go swirly, and you kinda know that something has happened. In my opinion, this is Big Mom's first hallucination, not as a result of withdrawal, but because of something inside of Simla. But obviously, we still have work to do to connect these various hallucination events in the post-time skip to Fairy Green and to Elbaf. So let's do that. So I guess I'm just going to say this up front. We'll probably say this again and justify it more later, but just so that you have context. Because the biggest problem with this theory right now is that, yes, we know that Big Mom has experienced hallucinations, and she's experienced these hallucinations not because of withdrawal symptoms, but because of literally eating candy, Simla, that sort of thing, which means that these things are hallucinogenic for her. It would obviously be a big deal to discover that Simla is hallucinogenic, because the whole video is about Fairy Green, which is a booze specific to Elbaf that causes hallucinations. Sometimes. The question really is this Big Mom specific? Is this unique to Big Mom, or can you apply it to other characters or other people sometimes? Basically, could Simla be hallucinogenic for others? And if so, why does it seem to affect Big Mom more? My answer, which again we will explain in more detail a little bit later in the video, my answer is that it has to do with dreams. These hallucinations are not random. My opinion is that it takes you into a literal dream world. So those that dream more than others are more susceptible to the effects. This is also why I think that the candy, the giantification element of the candy, only worked on children. Children simply innately dream more than adults. I think that this is part of the reason why candy worked on them. But for now, just keep this in mind. I say this on a number of occasions, including in my last chapter reaction, but Oda likes to front-load foreshadowing. He loves to cram a lot of foreshadowing at the beginning of the arc, a lot of ideas, concepts, things that you can draw from it that will end up becoming important later. And then we go through the arc and essentially you forget about it until it comes back up. But basically what I'm saying is that the entire prologue of Elbaf, with the Straw Hats and the diorama, is foreshadowing to the literal rest of Elbaf. A treasure trove of clues. It is not a coincidence that in the last chapter we learned that Treasure Tree Adam is susceptible to fires, that once a fire starts it does not stop, and then in the diorama, one of the lore of the land essentially was that fires on the tree and the diorama was a big deal and that would make the sun god very angry. The foreshadowing has paid off. But when I was reacting to these chapters live, I think the thing that I brought up most commonly was the similarities between the story in the diorama and Alice in Wonderland. Granted, it was a twisted version of Alice in Wonderland, but the parallels are there. Alice followed a white rabbit into a whole new world. Luffy and crew were isekai'd into a whole new world. He ends up meeting a white rabbit and then eats it, which I'm still convinced that Oda laughed for a very long time about. Afterwards, they end up meeting a cat who looks somewhat like the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland. But this cat is not helping them in their adventures, not a friend, is just straight up an enemy. Oh, and by the way, just like the Cheshire Cat, this cat shapeshifts. But as we learn later, inside of the diorama is not quote-unquote the real world. They are in a literal dreamland, this being the dream of Road, who is posing as the sun god. As was explained later, all of the giants dream to one day become the sun god. Road is no different. The diorama is his dream. A very solid model of the Elbaf outside, where Road can pretend. So Luffy and Gru end up going through a mirror, or a looking glass, to the real Elbaf outside. This directly relates to the Alice in Wonderland sequel called Through the Looking Glass and what Alice found there. I'm sure everybody knows the story of Alice in Wonderland because it is pop culture at this point in time, like the original story where she follows a rabbit and then goes into a hole. Well, in the sequel, in order to reach Wonderland, she goes through a mirror. So as we have established that the diorama was the dream world, and that outside of the diorama is the real world, then Oda has effectively twisted Alice in Wonderland through the looking glass. But then once the Straw Hats go through the mirror and into Elbaf proper, they are now tiny humans in a giant-sized room, which goes back to Alice in Wonderland. There's more than this that I could potentially explain, and we did in reviews, but I think that you get it. The prologue of Elbaf is heavily inspired by Alice in Wonderland, and the entire idea of Alice in Wonderland is effectively Wonderland. Woman goes to a dream world. Just as the tree catching fire is foreshadowing that has now paid off, I think that the idea of Elbaf as a dream world is eventually going to make a lot of sense to us. So at this point, we have attempted to compare the children of Punk Hazard who ate candy, Big Mom who was addicted to sweets, with Elbaf and with Fairy Green. Essentially, we speculated that there is some unique property in Sky Islands that leads to giantification. Caesar Clown, who was attempting to create a drug which made children giant, stumbled upon something similar to what is naturally present in the sky. This connection then draws our attention to the other symptoms that the children of Punk Hazard experienced while they were being gigantified: rages, forgetfulness, and hallucinations. All of this then makes Big Mom very interesting, because Big Mom demonstrates all of these symptoms, and the trigger seems to have occurred after she consumed Simla, which was made in the island of Elbaf. Then, if we start thinking that Simla has the potential to cause hallucinations in a similar way as Fairy Green, it then opens up a new possibility, because the Straw Hats have been consuming Fairy Green. And in real time, we are watching them become more aggravated. Are we not? I don't know if I want to totally reiterate this theory because we made it in the last chapter review, chapter 1141. I'll link it in the description. We basically spent the whole review talking about this theory, but the premise essentially is that these Straw Hats are acting very strange. In the most recent chapters, Luffy in particular, the guy who dreams the most, has been very quick to get angry. So much so that in the last chapter, he's just yelling at Zoro over and over, almost acting like a child. And this isn't just a one-off thing, because in the chapter beforehand, he got really angry at Scopper for a very mild criticism of Shanks. In the very same chapter, you see Nami is very frustrated that there was no treasure in Elbaf's treasure room, and she expresses this in a very uncharacteristically dumb way, loudly, while the actual giant guards are there. It's simply an un-Nami-like moment. We also talked about Zoro in the review, but I think that the most important example from the chapter was actually Usopp, because Oda essentially confirmed to us that Usopp is acting strangely. Nami and Brook made an excuse for him, right? Usopp is drunk. This is his dream. But at the end of the day, these excuses were made, and this moment was highlighted because Usopp is not acting normally. And in the chapter, Usopp is aggressive in a way we have never seen from him before, literally smacking the sword in Elder Jarl's head. And there's this moment where he tells Hyruden to shut up. So I think that the Strats are experiencing something similar to what Big Mom experienced and similar to the children of Punk Hazard. And essentially we speculated that this was the warning that Louis Arnott tried to give. Do not overstay your welcome. Elbaf has an effect on the emotional state of those who visit. The longer you stay, the stronger it is. But as with most things, and as you might expect, I do think that it is a bit more complicated than what I'm trying to intimate to you. Because you can look at the children of Punk Hazard and you can look at Big Mom, and there are two extremes to this experience. The anger is foiled by joy. When Big Mom eats Simla, or she eats Crokimbush, she's not angry. It is literally the happiest moment in her life. And while we might call Usopp more aggressive than normal, the reality is that right now, Usopp is in heaven. Outside of the consequences of what might happen next, right, Usopp is going to look back on this as one of the greatest moments in his life. So this is certainly not a rage. This is closer to ecstasy. But then you flip this and you look at Luffy, and Luffy is seemingly having moments of rage. So we have the components of Big Mom and the children, but they're kind of out of order and difficult to understand. My explanation for this goes back to dreams. The commonality of all the weirdness for all of the Straw Hats, I think, has a lot to do with their own personal dreams. Basically, you can think of it as they are being consumed by their dreams. As they are pursuing their dreams, or as they are living their dreams, they experience immense joy. Like normally you would feel joy in these circumstances, but in Elbaf it is stronger, potentially a bit addictive. So in Elbaf, it is very easy to get lost in your dreams or desires. But this comes at a price. If something or someone becomes an obstacle to the pursuit of their dreams, you see something similar to a rage, which I believe will become worse over time. So now let's recontextualize what has happened, right? Nami leaves the party in pursuit of treasure. Treasure is her desire. She is really hyped up to go find this treasure, finds that it is missing. Later, you have something akin to a rage. It's mild, but it's a little un-Nami-like. She's a little madder than normal. You can then look at Luffy. One of the first things that Luffy does when he arrives in Elbaf is he meets Loki, and Loki promises him that he has intel on where Shanks is so that Luffy can pursue and fulfill one of his lifelong dreams, to return the hat to Shanks. Luffy then becomes obsessed with this dream. In a very un-Luffy-like way, he seems willing to put the entire island of Elbaf in danger just so that he can fulfill it. And then it so happens that the obstacles in the road, Scopper Gaban keeping the key from him, as well as Zoro saying that he's not going to free Loki, makes Luffy irrationally mad. Luffy is raging. Again, it is mild, but I do think that it is happening. Zoro is more complicated than this, but I feel like I've talked about him too much recently, so we're going to skip over it. But at the same time, right, Usopp, Robin, and Frankie are currently lost in their dreams. No obstacles as of yet, but they may be coming. What happens when someone steps in the way of Robin in the true history? Or her time with Saul? What happens when somebody tries to step in the way of Frankie and his investigation of Treasure Tree Adam? These are curious questions to me. But yeah, long story short is I think that what is happening to the Strats right now might be compared to Big Mom. Essentially, while you're in Elbaf and living out your dreams and having fun every single day, Elbaf is a paradise, but it can quickly flip for some people if you cannot get what you want. So Big Mom ate Simla, it became her dream, and then eventually it became the source of her rage. Are you guys having fun? Is this theory interesting? To me, it is. And I guess now that we have laid out all of this, which I hope was compelling, it's finally time to take it all and really explain what is going on with the island of Elbaf and why Fairy Green causes hallucinations. Because I have a very, very specific answer. If you haven't listened to me explain this before, it might sound wild, but I promise you that it's not. I believe that these Sky Islands are contaminated with soul. And in fact, I think that Sky Cloud is literally made out of it. In Skypiea, Pagya was explaining how Sky Cloud was created, and he brought up this chemical known as pyrobrine. We made a whole theory about this. I'll include a link in the description. You don't have to watch it, but, it's related. But essentially, pyrobrine is also present in sea stone. So the thing which makes sea stone also makes Sky Cloud. Sea stone, which is this thing which has a very unique interaction with devil fruit users. We'll come back to this eventually. But I suppose I'll just let Pagya explain it. When explaining the creation of Sky Cloud, this is what he says. Particles of keratin are hurled into the sky by volcanoes, and they absorb moisture. Depending on their density, they either become sea clouds or island clouds. Particles of keratin. If you are not aware, keratin is like, for instance, what makes your skin. But if you're curious as to whether or not this translation is accurate, if you break down the original Japanese, what Pagya is saying this particle is dead skin particles. Literally translated, Oda is telling us that dead skin particles are flung into the sky through volcanoes, and when it interacts with moisture in the atmosphere, it creates sky cloud. And I would assume if it interacts with moisture in like a river or the ocean, it makes sea stone. When you start talking about dead skin particles, something like the soul is not so crazy. They are particles of people's death. So the next question that I have is why dead skin particles exist within the earth to be released through volcanic activity. I believe that this was also foreshadowed or explained in Skypiea. In Nolan and Kalgra's flashback, the Shandians had some very interesting lore related to the soul. They believed that the souls of their ancestors resided within their sacred trees, and they believed that the beautiful sound of the golden belfry called their souls to these trees. Full disclosure, I think that this lore is real in the world of One Piece. Trees capture souls. The specifics of it aren't important, I just think that it happens. And yes, you should be thinking about devil fruits, and I think that this is very related to the creation of Caesar's artificial smile devil fruit. SAD, I believe, to be soul, a substance pumped into streams, absorbed by trees, which then produce fruits. But I've talked about this often, so let's just move on. I'm sure that you do not need me to explain this to you, but trees do not live forever. No matter how old they are, no matter how long-lived they are, trees do eventually die. They die and then get buried in the ground. And if they get buried deep enough, eventually you get something like coal. A lump of coal might look dull to you, but it is in fact a time capsule because each piece holds traces of an ancient forest. Some even have fossilized leaves or bark imprints. This is also very similar to other fossil fuels such as natural gas. Natural gas is formed deep underground over millions of years from the remains of ancient marine organisms and plants. And the whole point of bringing all these things up is that we're talking about life trapped in the ground and then released through volcanic activity. This is, in my opinion, Oda's inspiration for dead skin particles. And I often combine this with the theory that in the world of One Piece, following Japan lore, as well as ancient pirate lore, the sea is supposed to be the underworld, where your soul eventually resides. In Davy Jones' locker. Probably also has something to do with the sea being the enemy of devil fruit users, but we've talked about this a lot, so we'll move on. Which also leads us back to pyro brine, which pyro means fire, brine is a salty solution. Fire, salt water. Basically, there are two places that your soul goes after you die, either into the ocean or trapped somewhere on land. Burning salt water, pyrobrine, or through volcanic activity, keratin, releases your soul back into the world. I really hope that this was not too much to digest, but I do think that it is that important. Long story short is Sky Cloud is literally comprised of people's soul, which would be a surprisingly fitting thing because back in Skypiea, the Sky Cloud is portrayed as heaven, and plants have the ability to consume and harbor this soul, such as in trees, but it doesn't just have to be trees. In the last chapter, as Zoro and Luffy are arguing, a lot of people, myself included, were reminded of Whiskey Peak. That was the arc where Luffy and Zoro had a fight. It's very similar to what's happening now because Luffy is just being unreasonable, and it's obviously frustrating to Zoro. But yeah, over the years, I've seen quite a bit of criticism for Whiskey Peak for one major reason, which is like, Luffy in that arc, in the fight for Zoro, like, what is going on there? That has never happened again. It stands out as noteworthy as like, what? Like, this does not feel like Luffy and Zoro. Luffy is agitated in a way we have never seen again. Well, maybe there's a reason for that. Look, I'm not sure if we're supposed to take this literally or if it's just supposed to be symbolic, but Whiskey Peak is located on Cactus Island. Now, these cactuses are rock, they're mountains. They're not actually plants, supposedly. But at the very least, symbolically, the spines that we see on Cactus Island are not actually spines. They are gravestones. The whole island is effectively a gigantic graveyard in the shape of a humongous plant. In my opinion, some subliminal messaging is taking place. Because if our theory is true, then Treasure Tree Adam, despite being a tree, is also literally a gigantic graveyard, minus the gravestones. So let's finally complete this theory. I think that the land which exists up in the sky, which is rare, we've only seen it with Upper Yard and with Elbaf so far, but when this happens, the land and the plants there feed off of the soul which naturally exists within Sky Cloud. So people do not grow large in Skypiea, right? The Skypieans who lived in Skypiea lived on the actual Sky Cloud. The things which live on the actual land in the sky, Upper Yard and or Elbaf, however, would grow, along with all of the plants that are there. How exactly this works is unclear, but if you were to take a stab at it, you can look at the Southbirds in Upper Yard versus the Southbirds in Jaya. Southbirds are very clearly based on like toucans, a kind of bird which eats fruits which grow from plants. Essentially, I think that the giantification substance is absorbed by plants. And if you eat the plants which grow on the land in the sky, then over time, as a creature, you would grow as well. Just an interesting side detail, but Upper Yard was fought over for hundreds of years, and I'm not entirely sure that there was anybody that lived there continuously the entire time. except for gods, because it was considered a holy land. So eating these plants, or eating the things which grow from these plants in the islands in the sky, matter. And they don't just gigantify you or your progeny over time. There's also a host of other side effects, such as hallucination. So why exactly are creatures and plants gigantified? Why exactly do people experience hallucinations? It's because they're literally eating soul. All of this perfectly takes us back to Big Mom, because Big Mom has the soul fruit. During her 6th birthday, she literally ate people. But even more than that, with the soul fruit, she takes people's souls and then infuses it into the various things around her, including food, which we know that she eats. We also know that when she rages, she also consumes soul. I think that what is inside the plants in Elbaf is very similar to Big Mom consuming actual soul. This has prolonged her illness. She is still taking the drug. What you need to understand about Fairy Green is a booze. And if this reflects the real world at all, the way that booze is made is by fermenting some kind of plant or product of a plant. Wine is fermented fruit. Sake is fermented rice. And beers are fermented wheat. If the Giants of Elbaf are based on Norse and Oda utilizes this history, then what the Giants actually drink is they drink beer, or more specifically, ale. And actually the word ale comes from the Norse word for beer. This was made using barley. Barley is a cereal grain you can think of a lot like wheat. As just a fun fact, this was an extremely important plant in ancient times for ancient civilizations because barley grows a little bit easier than actual wheat in harsher climates. But it should not be surprising that being a cousin of wheat, barley is absolutely used in baking and was absolutely used in ancient times to make various kinds of breads, or I guess pastries, perhaps like Simla. This, in my opinion, is the connection between Simla and Fairy Green, and why both have the ability to cause hallucinations. For some people, sometimes. But to explain the hallucinations, I think that the best place to look is devil fruit. Devil fruit were explained to us by Dr. Vegapunk as incarnations of people's desires or dreams. Through their magic, dreams essentially become reality. There is a connection between these fruits which grow from special trees that we're not entirely sure of and people's dreams, or potentially nightmares. All of this is happening, in my opinion, because as you eat a devil fruit, or as you eat a plant which grows in the Sky Islands, it connects you with some kind of dream world or an afterlife. So drinking Fairy Green or eating Simla is a very poor man's version of eating a devil fruit. It doesn't fundamentally change your nature, but the effects are related, and the experience can be very, very addictive. All of this takes us back to Caesar Clown and Candy. The thing which Dr. Vegapunk discovered is the lineage factor, and Caesar has been basing his research off of Vegapunk's discovery as well. We were explicitly told that Caesar designed Smile artificial devil fruits because of Vegapunk's discovery of lineage factor. Lineage factor, which is described to us in a way similar to DNA, but I also think is heavily related to the One Piece soul. So it's this which connects the children of Punk Hazard, Candy, to Big Mom, to Elbaf, and now the Straw Hats. Oda has been building up to this reveal for the entirety of the post-time skip. You don't know it yet, but through Fairy Green, we are actually learning about devil fruit. This is why the booze in Elbaf is special. Anyway, guys, I know here at the end that we got really, really crazy in a oddly specific way. But I do think that this discussion is important. Right or wrong, I feel like there's elements of this which will definitely come into play. Kind of like in Nolan and Kalgra's flashback, we find out that the Shandians worship these sacred trees. But it's actually these sacred trees which eventually are a disease to the island itself and kill off all the people. Whether it is exactly the same or not is really unimportant. I do think that Treasure Tree Adam itself is killing the inhabitants of Elbaf. It's in effect diseased. This might not make sense to you right now, and it absolutely will not make sense to the people who live in Elbaf, the Giants, or the Straw Hats, but the solution that Nolan came to eventually was to cut down these sacred trees, and I think that the same thing is needed for Treasure Tree Adam. Being one of the world's most ancient trees, potentially thousands of years old, it contains a whole lot of soul. And I actually think that it is not a good thing that these souls are there. This is not supposed to be their final resting place. They are trapped, potentially unable to move on. Or if One Piece follows Buddhist or Hindu mythology, Eastern mythology, right, these souls are not reborn. So we've learned recently that the greatest threat to the country of Elbaf is fire and lightning, because once Treasure Tree item catches fire, the fire does not go out. In a sense, it is like a big lump of coal. This is actually related to things that have happened in the real world, but there are coal deposits that have caught fire, and they burn for centuries, potentially even longer. The giants are afraid of this happening to the tree, but this might end up being the thing that is needed. But as always, there are a million other things that we could potentially talk about. The fact that Fairy Green is a booze sticks out to me. You could talk about Binks Sake. You could talk about Whiskey Peak. Based on our conversation today, you could talk about delivering Binks Sake as, for instance, delivering somebody's soul that is trapped. And now, as we are talking about people's souls, we're also talking about their desires or their dreams, which makes Binks Sake work in two ways simultaneously, fulfilling Binks' dream. So feel free to keep going if you are inspired to, because this theory leaves room. But like I said, guys, I really hope that you understood what we were saying today, and I hope that you enjoyed the video, and at the very least it gave you something to think about.